Hello, everybody. My name's Nick Hillman. I'm director of HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, and I'm talking to you from our Oxford HQ. And this is a joint webinar that we're putting on with Jisc, and we're absolutely delighted to be doing so. Just to remind people of the title for today's event, it is Competition or Collaboration: Opportunities for the Future of the HE Sector. And we're jointly hosting it, as I say, with Jisc, but also KPMG are involved because they recently published a very relevant paper on this topic with Jisc, which I think will underscore some of the conversation. And we might put a link to that in the chat. And just as I was preparing for today, 3 quotes from that really stood out for me that might help set up the conversation from the people they spoke to while putting our report together. One was an anonymous person who said, "Students don't choose to go to a university based on their finance system," which I think is a useful reminder. Secondly, someone said, "My institution doesn't even collaborate with itself. I'm a governor of 2 universities, a very large one and a very small one." And that I've heard similar comments before all over the sector. And a third quote is, "We would focus collaboration on areas that we're just starting as a sector." Sorry, we should focus collaboration on areas that we're just starting as a sector, free from legacy infrastructure and existing barriers, such as micro-credentials and degree apprenticeships. So just 3 useful quotes from that particular report. So the format for today is we're going to hear from 4 speakers, 4 excellent speakers who I will introduce in a moment. They will speak for 5 to 7 minutes each, and then we should have about half of the hour that we've got for comments and contributions from the floor. Please do keep them coming in. I suggest you put them in the Q&A. We'll keep the chat for things like the link that my colleague Emma's just put in the chat, and I will try to ask the questions in the order in which they are upvoted. So if there are particular questions there you want to see posed to the panelists, do get up voting. And so our 4 speakers, and we'll go through them in the order that were listed on the event details. First, we'll hear from Liam Ernie, who is Managing Director at Jisc. I'll let him tell you what Jisc does, though most of you will probably already know. Then we'll hear from Sam Sanders, who's Advisory Lead for Education, Skills and Productivity at KPMG, who I've already mentioned. Then we'll hear from Steph Harris, who many of you will know through her role at Universities UK, and she's currently Director of Strategy, Insights and Member Engagement, so crucial, for example, in putting the UUK blueprint together, which is another document that might underscore some of today's conversation. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Professor Sir Chris Husbands, former Vice-Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam University, former Chair of the TEF and current Trustee of HEPI, and indeed the author of a very influential recent HEPI paper called 4 Futures, which looks at different alternative possible routes for the higher education sector. And we might add in to the webinar chat both the link to the UUK blueprint and the 4 Futures report. So with no further ado, other than to say this is an on-the-record event, so I hope that won't hold anybody back. But if you're posing a question, remember, it will be on the record. Journalists are online, and we'd like to make the recording available to the public afterwards. And when it comes to posing your question, we'll try to turn your microphone on so you can ask your own question. But don't worry, we won't turn on your cameras. So if you're not in work clothing or anything, don't worry, it will just turn on your microphone. So with no further ado, Liam, over to you. You've been doing a lot of thinking on collaboration and competition. Tell us more.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. Good afternoon, everybody. And for those of you who don't know, Jisc is a sector agency in the UK. We provide a number of critical infrastructure services, such as the Janet network, but we also provide negotiation services, cybersecurity services, data. We are the statutory data body responsible for HESA. We also provide a range of advice and guidance to institutions. I wanted to spend a few minutes at the beginning just talking about some of our own observations around the report. And I wanted to start with, why did we commission the report? And 2 factors informed that decision. The first was that in response to a worsening financial situation, more and more of the discussions that we were having with colleagues from across the sector were focused on how digital could help address the cost challenges that they were facing and mitigate those challenges. Invariably, those conversations came with a second suggestion and request, which was it'd be great if Jisc could build one or other shared system which would remove those problems for them. So that fed into our second factor around the decision to commission this work, which was based on our own experience as a provider of a number of services. We were far from convinced that just building something new would be helpful. We thought it took a narrow view of the scope for collaboration. And we also observed that from our work on digital transformation within institutions, you needed to pay as much, if not more, attention to people, culture, process, leadership, training, etc., if those programs were to be successful. So we wanted to proactively explore with colleagues from across the sector where those opportunities for collaboration existed, what the barriers to their success might be, and what needed to be in place in order to overcome those challenges, and situate all of that in the context of the sector as it is today. The second point that I wanted to make was to really highlight the degree of consensus that we found from across stakeholders. And we spoke to colleagues working across IT, across libraries, across a range of professional services, registrars, DVCs, VCs, etc. And there was remarkable consensus across the board, be it on the challenges faced around financial sustainability, technical debt, systems implementation, supplier management, etc., be it the number of things that were being done locally within an institution that didn't really enhance the unique value proposition of that institution, but had developed organically in response to local drivers over time. Be it the belief that collaboration should play a much greater role in helping to address those challenges, but also a pragmatism and realism that the need for collaborative endeavours, they have to be able to demonstrate that they're worth the investment of time, energy, and most importantly, money. Everybody was agreed that it was a preferable route conceptually, but that didn't blind anyone we spoke to the fact that it needed to be feasible and underpinned by a viable business case. I then wanted to turn to the spectrum of opportunities that we uncovered. They exist across multiple domains, from back office operations through research, innovation, teaching, learning, and assessment. Across multiple scales, it doesn't have to be entirely UK and sector-wide to make a difference. Indeed, in terms of building trust and demonstrating success, starting with smaller coalitions of the willing might be optimum. And in a multitude of ways, from a focus on common approaches to the management of data and systems, the adoption and embedding of standards, the shared provision of skills development and staff capacity, collective approaches to licensing, supplier engagement, federated approaches to the provision of digital research infrastructure, or shared commissioning of entire systems. The work demonstrated that there was a wide variety of opportunities with varying levels of complexity and impact that could be examined. But the most importantly, putting in place a mindset that prioritizes collaboration over competition is essential. Fourth, I think it's really important to note that if we don't address the situation now, it's not going to get any easier. Technical debt is only going to get worse. Fragmentation and proliferation of approaches will only undermine institutions' ability to respond to individual and collective ambitions around things like lifelong learning, the adoption of AI, micro-credentials, the ability to take advantage at scale of new technologies. So even if we don't want to collaborate across institutions, individual institutions have a local rationale for addressing those challenges so that they can operate as effectively as possible. And fifth and finally, I'd observe that we're not starting from scratch. There are already great examples of collaboration delivering real benefits. In my own career at Jisc, I've been fortunate enough to work with colleagues at UCISA, at Sconnell, RL UK, BOFDOG, Universities UK on a variety of negotiations to ensure we can get the best arrangements for individual institutions, and where we've worked hard to demonstrate the benefits of system-wide approaches, where everyone in the sector is heard, where we have that senior level support, and we have a consistent approach to engagement around collective endeavours. The report highlights examples from Scotland and Wales, such as Hephaestus with its shared provision of expert staff, or Wealth's shared library management system in Wales, There's also that network of procurement consortia, sector agencies like UCAS, JISC, Advanced HE. So we already have as a sector a shared capability that could be utilised to greater effect, in our opinion, to help address some of the challenges that institutions are dealing with today. Thank you.
Thank you, Liam. So with no further ado, I'm going to go straight over to our second speaker, Sam, and do keep the questions coming in so we can put them to the panelists in a moment.
Thank you, Nick. And firstly, just to sort of echo some of the things that Liam was saying, I think what was really heartening for us was the sheer amount of agreement that we came across when supporting JISC on this paper. There was a huge sort of swell of support from everyone we spoke to about the need to look into this as a topic of important conversation, which I have to say, having worked in the sector for a number of years, hasn't always been the case. So like Liam, I don't want to talk for too long. Hopefully you'll all have had a chance to look at the report. So I don't want to play it back to you verbatim, but I did want to make a few key points as an observer, an advisor to the sector, so somebody consistently in the sector, but not always of the sector, in terms of our observations around what's come out. So I think firstly, it's worth noting that we are in quite a different situation than the sector has previously been in. I personally have lived through 2 or 3 quite significant efficiency pushes or waves of efficiency over the last sort of 15, 20 years of working across the sector. But this one feels quite different. And I think what that allows, whilst being incredibly problematic and challenging, is it allows conversations to be had that until now sometimes haven't had the airspace they need. So I think what's important is to take the opportunity presented by sort of some of this challenge to really explore options that I think logically we've all known are entirely feasible for a long time, but really haven't had the impetus behind them. So to start with, in terms of sort of perception, I think when we have previously had conversations around collaboration, sharing of services, better working together, there's always been a bit of a perception that it's too hard to do for some good reasons and also for some sort of historical legacy reasons. I mean, firstly, you do as a sector find yourself in an interesting situation, which makes collaboration hard, sort of a quasi market economy whereby you are encouraged to both compete and collaborate. And at the same time, do so within a very constrained market setup with sort of fee caps and things like that, which you don't get in other walks of life, which is very challenging. Also, the fact that from a return on investment perspective and a business case perspective, it's always been very hard to justify the investment that's been required to push forward in some of these areas. And that's something we're very keen to sort of explore today. I think the reality is, and what became very apparent very early on in this conversation, was actually there are huge numbers of examples of where the sector already collaborates really well, as Liam mentioned. You know, the fact that this is being sort of partly hosted by JISC, many things it just does are excellent examples, like Janet, for example, of fantastic bits of collaboration across the sector. So if you look across and if you have a look in the report, there are many examples of effective long-term collaboration, which sometimes go unnoticed. They're almost, so much part of the fabric of the sector now, they don't get the sort of credit they deserve. But what's really interesting, what really came out strongly, is where those conversations have halted. It hasn't been because there is a very good rationale or reason within universities for stifling competition. So a lot of what universities do, and this came out very strongly, isn't USP. It doesn't define whether or not a student chooses to go to University X or University Y. You know, the quote at the beginning that Nick mentioned around, students don't choose to come to your university because of the quality of your finance system is absolutely true. And I think whilst that has been understood and recognised in the back office for many years, there is now a perception and an understanding that that actually applies to a huge amount outside of the classroom space, outside of the digital teaching space, and outside of the laboratory from a research perspective. Huge amounts of what universities do actually don't differentiate that university, other than perhaps making them slightly more efficient and allowing for reinvestment in other places. So there's a huge amount that can be looked at, I think, within the scope of the current university setup. But there are 3 recurring challenges, and this came out very strongly. Firstly is culture. So the perception that huge amounts of what universities do is differentiating and competitive. Secondly, the absence of coordination at the moment. So somebody to actually bring together these threads of argument and conversation and assist in the brokering of next steps. And then thirdly, as was mentioned, business case. And I think especially on the business case piece, one of the things we've discovered through helping various consortia of universities over the years is if you are looking for short-term or immediate savings from better collaboration, it's probably not the place to start. If you're looking for longer-term benefits, huge benefits, and also potentially future-proofing the operating model of higher education, then absolutely there is very little that would logically stop you wanting to go down that route. So putting aside for a moment the timescales around return on investment issue, the logic and benefit of moving towards a more standardized, where relevant, more collaborative, where relevant model are hugely beneficial. And I think we can see from global examples where that has worked very well. You can sustain the important branding, the recognition, the status of an institution, while still collaborating further on lots of the day-to-day activity that happens. So I shall stop there. I'm very happy to answer questions as they come up.
Thank you so much, Sam. There are lots of questions flooding in, and I will go through them in upvoted order at the right moment. So next, I'm going to turn to Steph Harris, who today is the voice of UUK. Steph, over to you.
And firstly, thanks for inviting me to be part of this webinar, and thank you to Jisc and KPMG for such a kind of great report at the kind of right time, I guess, as this conversation is kicking off again in the sector. One of the things that the kind of report spoke about was the kind of need for leadership in this space, and sometimes I guess that this change needs to be kind of catalysed by someone to get it off the ground. And some of you might be aware that the blueprint that Nick very kindly mentioned earlier that UUK published last year mentioned that UUK was going to look at a programme of work in this space to think about how it could support both transformation and efficiency within the sector, but to support that from, I guess, a collaboration angle and thinking about what opportunity there is for universities to do more together. And we have kind of launched that programme of work, launched it before Christmas, and it's being overseen by a task force, which is being chaired for us by Sir Nigel Carrington, who is probably known to many of you as the former Vice-Chancellor at the University of Arts, London. And that kind of programme of work has kind of one key aim from our point of view, or at least from my point of view, and that's kind of be useful. That's kind of all we're trying to do something useful for the sector and to kind of support our members at this time. The programme, as I've said, explicitly focus on what can be achieved together. It's explicit focus on collaboration, not just kind of broad transformation and efficiency. And we're really focusing down on, what can we achieve together at a system level? So what can we achieve at kind of national, regional level or a local level? What can you achieve through a group structure, and what can be achieved through individual universities, and looking at all of those different types of collaboration. I guess the other thing it's probably useful to reflect on is kind of why is this programme of work necessary, and why is it necessary now? And I probably don't need to sit here and kind of tell you all about why transformation and efficiency is probably an important topic for us to be focusing on, given the kind of financial context that the sector finds itself in. But it clearly was also, from an English perspective, one of the kind of 5 areas that the Secretary of State set out as part of her kind of reform agenda when announcing the uplift to the tuition fees in England. So it's also important from that perspective. But why collaboration? Why focus on collaboration rather than kind of broad transformation and efficiency at an individual level? Well, it seems to me, although I'm really happy to kind of get into debate about this, that one of the things that has happened to the higher education sector over the last decade or so is that it's become more competitive, and that's been a kind of deliberate policy choice over a number of years by successive governments to make that so. And I'm not here to kind of, and this piece of work is not here to kind of assign a kind of value judgment of that, just to kind of point out that one of the flip sides of introducing competition into the system is that sometimes it can make collaboration harder, both kind of real. It can, actually make collaboration harder, or it can just bring in a perception that collaboration is harder. And this piece of work, aims to kind of put that on the table, look at it, and I guess answer the question of how we can support greater collaboration in the sector at this point in time. And Liam's already talked about the kind of long history that the sector has here. The kind of Jisc, a perfect example of sector collaboration, UCAS, Advanced HE, and you can see it at that kind of national level, that system level, but you can also see it in the individual kind of origin stories of universities. Most universities would have a story about kind of how they started and how they came together and how they've evolved over time, and often that story involves more than one institution coming together. So very quickly, what we're hoping to do with this programme of work, and then how can you get involved? There are real kind of three strands to the transformation and efficiency work that we're hoping to lead. First of which is a kind of review type activity, which will both kind of look back, look at what has changed in the last decade since the Diamond Review, and then look forward and look at what the opportunities might be for the future. And I think this speaks to one of the quotes that you pulled out from the report at the beginning, Nick, about that, perhaps it might be easier in some cases to kind of collaborate where you're doing something new, where there are kind of new opportunities arising, rather than collaborating where there is kind of strong existing provision. And it will make some recommendations predominantly for the sector, and those recommendations are not supposed to be top-down and imposed. They're supposed to be collaborative and inclusive, and they are crucially about what the sector would like to kind of do for itself. And so one of the challenges here, quite rightly, when I talk to people about this work, is that you need to be really careful about making sure that you are rightly telling the story of what efficiency is already happening in the sector, and not just focusing on kind of what more could be done. But it is an opportunity for the sector to really think through kind of what does it want to do for itself, and we should kind of grasp that opportunity, I think. The second strand is looking at specific projects, and Liam and Sam have already touched on their report, and it's really building on that. And then lastly, the third, I guess, is in our role as the Universities UK is kind of convening people and bringing people together to learn from one another and to learn from other kind of wider experts as well on topics in this area. And we also know, again, to kind of Liam and Sam's point, that this work it takes a long time to realise benefits, but nonetheless it's kind of urgent. We kind of need to get on with it. So we're hoping that it will report by the spring. And of course, it is a kind of collective sector effort, so there will be ways that you can kind of get involved in the project as it kind of gets up and running, and I guess kind of look out for the kind of usual communications from both ourselves, but also from Jisc and other partners as we get up and running. But I'll leave it there, Nick, and hand back to you.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Steph. And thanks for all the practical suggestions you made of how people can get involved and get their voice heard. So I'm going to go to Chris Husbands, Professor Sir Chris Husbands, as our final speaker before we go to the Q&A. Chris, good day.
Thank you, Nick. So my perspective, an institution leader, led 2 institutions through complex change, including one into merger. And more recently, I've been working with institutions across the sector on issues of quality, leadership and sustainability through Higher Futures, and also with the RSA on some work on digital micro-credentialing. So I'm going to make points under 4 headings: the scale of the challenge, what's currently happening, barriers to change, and ways forward. And there'll be a 1-phrase summary for each section. So on the scale of the challenge, we need to be clear the unit of resource for undergraduate teaching in 2025 is in real terms getting pretty close to the 1997 level that led the Blair government to introduce top-up fees. And there's a credible argument that the challenge may be as great as the 1981 cuts to HE, which saw huge reductions in institutional funding. Salford University at that stage lost 45% of its funding. Growth options have been stretched, and the OFS have rightly called out optimism bias in the sector's forecasts. And then in many parts of the world, there is rapid growth of very flexible private provision as a challenge to established models. And much of that growth has been backed by finance funds with very deep pockets on technical and market investment, and there's been very rapid scale of change in Germany, in Canada, and France. So the position is serious. Secondly, what's happening? Well, I've been really struck over the last year by the scale and scope of institutional restructuring. There have been major strides in rethinking operating models, particularly for professional services, but far fewer strides in rethinking business models for the core academic research and teaching activity of the university, the core delivery model, staff-student ratios, structure of staffing, flexibilities, and estate use. And I think institutions are still finding it difficult to look at the challenge in a sufficiently strategic and holistic way with an eye to the long-term shape, size, structure, and positioning of the university. So my one sentence summary is there's a lot happening, but probably not enough. Thirdly, just want to identify 4 big barriers to change. There are other barriers, including important technical ones. There's a couple of interesting issues in the questions. And Sam and Liam have covered a lot of issues around the challenges. But for me, the 4 key points to make here are, first of all, without a secure and deliverable core academic model, institutions are simply going to be forced into repeated restructurings on other aspects of their activity, and that's not going to be healthy for institutions or the sector. Secondly, the culture of individual autonomy, even and perhaps especially in non-competitive services, as others have said, is a major barrier. Thirdly, I think there is a perception, and again, I think this underlies some of the questions, of the risk of dependence of the sector or big chunks of the sector on single suppliers. The market for services, the HE market for services is not big, and a privately provided single system could hand huge power to a private contractor. The sector needs to be able to think cohesively in order to avoid that risk. And finally, collaboration, this is a point I think that Sam and Liam have both made already, but collaboration and shared services are unlikely to deliver cost savings in the short term. And given the scale of the short-term financial challenges, at the moment, I think the sector is shaped by Keynes's dictum that in the long run, we're all dead. So my conclusion is that the barriers to change are largely cultural. So fourthly, and finally, what next? Well, Nick has already mentioned 4 Futures, the pamphlet I wrote last year. And in 4 Futures, I argued that the financial and funding circumstances that produce the sector that we have now have gone, and that we're going to need a reshaped sector, almost certainly more layered, almost certainly more differentiated, and almost certainly more flexible. So that's about funding, but it's also about universities being much clearer about and playing to the things they can do well and do well sustainably. Government is unwilling or unable to pay for the sector that most university leaders want, and we have to find a way of occupying the gap that does exist. Secondly, and I'm very clear about this, competition has delivered real benefits for the sector, especially in estate investment, student experience, and research quality. And goodness knows, I was a competitive vice-chancellor. But competition has also delivered homogeneity, duplication, over-provision, and some overlap. And that needs to change. And the way we navigate our way, not necessarily wholly away from competition, but towards a new competitive landscape, I think is one of the really big challenges. Thirdly, there is a gap. There is no prospect of significant funding from central government. but institutions alone are struggling with change. The solution needs to be a shift in the culture of leadership. And the Jisc KPMG report is absolutely right that the culture of leadership needs to change. That's going to be tough, but it can be done, and it has been done in other sectors. And near the end of the report, there is a very good quote where it says, given the current trajectory, there is a window of opportunity for institutions to act now and to help drive this forward before they're compelled into action by necessity. And I think that if we are a self-confident sector, confident about our social value, about our value to the nation, and our significance in the long term, we have to find the confidence to work differently. So my final sentence is there is no single blueprint for what the sector or institutions need to look like, and leadership will involve helping to work that out collaboratively. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris. And the questions have come in thick and fast. So I'm going to go straight to them. I'm going to go to them in the order of popularity. So the most upvoted ones, starting with Nick Braisby and going to Johnny Rich. And I'm going to take 4 or 5 in a go because I want to get through as many as possible. And I said before we went live to all the panelists, they do not need to answer every question. And if I could ask the panelists to keep their answers brief and the questioners to keep their questions brief, then we can get through as many of these 18 as we can. So Nick, hopefully your microphone is about to be turned on. Nick Braisby, Vice Chancellor of Bucks New University, my local university. Nick.
Hello, Nick, can you hear me?
Yes, over to you.
Thank you very much. Great seminar, incidentally. Thank you very much. The question really reflects the realism with which universities might collaborate. And I posed a question about student record systems because we're in the middle of such a project. Every institution I speak to bemoans the horrors of actually trying to commission a student record system. And I know in the past it's been mooted that Jisc actually might help engineer a sort of sector-wide, sector-owned product. It would certainly bring great efficiencies, but it would of course depend on individual institutions being willing to sacrifice the very special features that they would wish to see in order to achieve the benefits. So the question is really, how realistic is it, do you think, that the sector could look to an agency like Jisc to help with either student record systems in particular or other complex digital projects? Could Jisc, for example, play a role almost as a dating agency in helping to form consortia of institutions that could at least leverage a better procurement solution? Or could indeed Jisc play a role in developing a sector-wide, sector-owned solution itself?
Great. Thank you, Nick. And Liam, we might look particularly to Liam to answer that one. Johnny Rich from the Engineering Professors Council next.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much, Nick. Thank you, everybody. How should universities build collaborations while also navigating competition law? And should competition law therefore be changed or exemptions created?
Thank you, Johnny. I had the same thought as I was reading the paper, so thank you for raising that. Nick Barrett, I'm going to go to next.
Thank you. It's a very similar question to Nick's, actually. Also, an institution about to go through the pain of a student record system procurement. We've had some interesting conversations around, again, commercial providers who don't want to be part of that 2 or 3 major suppliers. Is there, in line with that dating agency approach, any opportunity for Jisc or these consortia to form up to really challenge the sector, not just in terms of keeping things as they are, but rethink what that core model would look like so that we are starting to move towards that commonality of purpose, and then maybe even start to create a more interesting plug-in or ecosystem of tools which might give us then the chance to select that point of differentiation. And I think there's also a wider question around some of the really long-standing sector problems that I know Jisc have been tackling around big deal library contracts, where again, an awful lot of university money is poured into maintaining the profits of some of these large organisations. I'm sure there must be a better way, maybe building out from some Jisc previous work around the National Bibliographic Database, for example.
Thank you. And Nick, which is your own institution?
Oh, sorry, Royal Holloway.
Royal Holloway, thank you. I'm going to go to Emma Woodcock, and then we might squeeze in Louis as well, and then I'll go back to the panel. Emma Woodcock. And Emma, tell us where you're from. Emma, can you hear us?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, brilliant. We can.
Hi, thanks, Nick. I'm the CIO at York St John University. I'm also the chair of UCISA. And my question is around a shared data model as opposed to a shared system. So one of the things I've seen in the sector for many years is that transformation projects are often inhibited by our legacy systems and data. There's lots of reasons for that. But in many cases, the legacy data is the problem. And I'm very mindful of what Sir Chris' husband said about not allowing one supplier to dominate any market. With a shared data model and shared data interoperability model, that would provide us with the ability for suppliers, multiple suppliers, and give us the ability to collaborate across systems for a true shared service rather than a shared system. I'm wondering if we're muddling up shared systems with shared services.
Thank you. And then last question in this round, and I do want to do at least one more round, so everyone please keep it brief. Louis, tell people where you're from, because I know you've moved roles relatively recently.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Louis Quaffeg-Gunn, I'm CEO of SILIP, so we're the Library and Information Association. So we've got members across higher education library services. My question was about whether this research or the panel had considered collaboration beyond the sector with other publicly funded institutions, so NHS, civil service, local authorities. For example, the earlier questioner talked about licensing deals. Could you do a collective license with a bunch of different public institutions, maybe even at a national scale? And then I also wondered how this agenda tallies with the civic university. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to go back to the panel. I'm going to start with Liam, because I think the first question was particularly aimed at you, Liam. But don't feel you need to answer all the points, because I want to go through as many as possible. Over to you.
So I think the theme around student record systems come up in a number of the comments and also in the chat. I think Les Ebden's point. I think actually, if we're honest, the student record system was probably the inspiration for the report as a whole. And if I'm even more honest, it was in a way of trying to help just navigate how exactly it would avoid being tasked with running a shared student record system on behalf of the whole sector. And I think part of that is because it addresses so many of the challenges that the report talks about. There is undoubtedly challenges around the systems themselves. But as Emma's mentioned, there's the data model, common approaches to the management of the data. So many of the challenges that institutions have are around business change processes internally in terms of the implementation of their systems, the fact that it touches on any number of other systems within an institution. So you very quickly get to one of those challenges where, having started off with a student record system, you're suddenly trying to address the entire digital estate of the institution and all of the culture and processes around everything else within an institution. You end up looking at the operating model as a whole. So I think that JISC is very happy to get involved. It is very happy to support the sector as it can, but the sector does need to genuinely understand what is the challenge it is actually seeking to address and what is the best way of going about that, rather than just going to, we need a new student record system. And I think that there's a point there again that Emma made actually about, and Chris made, about one vendor, almost, and it's happened to me before, people saying, why don't we give JISC all the money to do all of the negotiations? How do you avoid us just becoming as bad as any other vendor in all of that space? So there's questions around governance, culture, process, mandates, etc., which need to be taken account of, which isn't me trying to get out of answering the question. It is just to illustrate that it is a very multi-tentacled challenge, which is why UUK's work, which is bringing in multiple stakeholders, etc., is so important.
That's a lovely segue to Steph then. Steph, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. I won't talk about shared student record systems because Liam's covered it off, and he and I have had this conversation before, and I started very much on the end of Liam. I just think we should build a national shared student record system. He can convince me that would be the wrong place to start, and actually the right place to start is the kind of at the systems level and thinking about kind of shared data models and other. I might just comment on competition law actually, and just pick up that one, Nick. And at the risk of sounding incredibly kind of simplistic, my kind of best advice for anybody is like, talk to your lawyers. Like, don't assume that it will be a barrier to you doing something. Get some advice from your kind of in-house legal team. As a kind of, we're a trade association, I'm not a university, so there's a different set of kind of competition law that applies to an organisation like Universities UK. But it doesn't have to be the barrier that you think it is all of the time. And to your, I can't remember if it was your point, Nick, in answering the question, or the kind of person posing the question, Johnny's question, but if you in doing that, as if in doing kind of setting up kind of collaborations and trying to think around issues in this space, you kind of uncover things in competition or that feel like they're a barrier to wanting you to do something, then like please do flag them, because there is also point of an organisation like the UK is to kind of flag where those barriers exist and explore the kind of opportunity with government and others to kind of remove them if we feel that they're there. But this is a challenge for your audience, actually, I've yet to find someone to come to me and say a competition law actually stopped me from doing this. But quite often people will come to me and say, I'm not quite sure if I can do this within the kind of law that exists. So kind of get the advice, but before you go off down that piece. And I'm sure there will be ideas that come up, some of the kind of ideas in the kind of Jisc KPMG report, that if we were to kind of pick them up as a sector and decide to do them and to take them forward, then obviously we'd need to get some specific advice around that. But again, I don't think that should be the kind of barrier that stops the initial conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, you mentioned KPMG there, so let's go to Sam.
Thank you. Nick, if I wouldn't mind picking up on the data model point. I think there's a few things I think really jumped out at me there. One is, as much as I think that the notion of a single student record system for the whole sector is a lovely idea, the reality is actually what that would do is stifle innovation and stifle the competition required to keep that thing up to date, to keep investment going in. We've seen in some areas with a very small number of credible competition options, the investment over multiple decades in key products hasn't been there, and that's one of the challenges. So the point I think was very well made around the shared data model is really, really important. But I think for me, it goes a bit further than that. I think it is worth universities, either in consortia, I think it's a good idea, or individually, challenging difference in some places. So one of the things that makes student record systems so complicated, for example, is the complexity of curricula. And in many, many instances, that is not driven by any particularly logical market ethos. So, for example, the big push probably about 15, 20 years ago to give students absolute choice in anything they wanted to study, those combinations of Gaelic and basket weaving, has seen universities with a huge tail of courses and options that actually never get picked up, but do put a lot of complexity into the system. So there are some simple business logic steps to take first in terms of rationalizing, focusing in on sensibly constructing all the basis for having a student record system in the first place. So a student record system in many respects is only as good as what it's recording, if you see what I mean. So I think along with the data model, some sensible simplification of options, certainly in our experience when we were doing customer engagement management work with lots of different, I use the word customer delivery there, lots of different universities, choice isn't always what students want. They don't always know how to make choice. So for example, that's a good area to look at to start with, to simplify things. To the point around whether or not there are others looking into the market to look collaboratively and sort of bring multiple institutions together into shared setups. There already are. So there are at least two I'm aware of situations where groups of institutions are coming together to consider this now. I won't go into that in great detail now because it's probably not the time or place, but certainly it's something that's already being explored more broadly. I'm sure many of you are actually actively involved in those conversations.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sam. I'm going to go to Chris, particularly on the Louis' question. I mean, at Hallam, if you'd stayed there for even longer, would you have done stuff with the local authority, with the local hospital? Should we be thinking outside our sector, even more than you already did with the local authority and the hospital, of course?
Well, I thought Louis' question was a really interesting one, and it has got me thinking very hard. I think that there are some things, and we were starting to do some thinking about this in Sheffield around procurement across anchor institutions, because it begins to, but not on an efficiency agenda. It was on a holding value within the local economy, and that was important. I think it's harder, Louis, to see this as something that solves the efficiency and sustainability question. I think it can deliver other social goods. And just to segue back a bit, the comments that we've heard were really interesting. But the bit that I would want to take away from this question, random questions, and think really hard about, I thought Emma Woodcock's comment about data model rather than shared system is a creative way to start thinking about what future architecture, plural, might look like. Because I do think, I'm with Liam, I don't see that a single national student record system has got anything other than trouble stamped all the way through it. But a data model takes us a lot further.
Great, thank you, Chris. Right, I'm going to go back. There's so many questions. I want to rattle through them. So Mary, another HEPI trustee and used to run a shared service, I guess, in Newcastle. Mary, over to you. Mary Kerner-Cook.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. And yes, trustee of HEPI is probably the easiest way to say who I am and what I do. I had a question specifically for Chris, actually, who said that there was a need to change the current culture of leadership, and I wanted to challenge him to say a bit more about what needs to change and what a more appropriate culture of leadership might look like, and also, Chris, whether you think that extends to more appropriate forms of governance as well as leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Governance is so important. We haven't talked that much about it. So, Chris, let rip on leadership in a minute. Paul Woodgate, who's another HEPI author. Paul, tell people what your interests are now and what your question.
Hello, thank you very much. I am Governor of De Montfort University. I'm on the board of Advanced HE and a number of other things around the sector. I wanted to follow up, really, I think, to Mary's question just now and about the cultural issues and leadership. It's always seemed to me that one of the barriers to collaboration is that university leaders believe that to ensure that something is a success, they need to control all the levers that affect it. They need to be able to manage risk, control costs, and so on. And the student record system is probably a very good example of that. If you can control all those things, you make the project work. But collaboration involves sharing control of levers rather than keeping them to yourself. How do we break down that barrier? How do we persuade university leaders that they should share control of the levers of a project?
Thank you, Paul. I'm thinking about how my children don't like to share things when you talk about vice chancellors there. Hugh, let's go to Hugh Jones, consultant. Hugh.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear me. So freelance consultant. I'm also deputy chair of the board at Birmingham City University, but this isn't a BCU question. And so I've observed across the sector, one of the challenges is universities not seeing just how urgent things are and how long collaboration can take before they get going on them. So you end up too late for it to be effective because you've thought, well, perhaps we can do a bit more work internally, perhaps we can do a bit more work on our own side of things to stave off the demons. How do we change that?
Thank you, Hugh. Nice succinct question. Ben, over to you. Ben Gill. Hopefully we can turn on Ben's microphone.
Can you hear me?
We can, Ben. Hi, where are you calling from?
Yeah, it was more just it's a simple question really, and it's sort of covered, but I guess a lot of people are talking about student record systems, but I was just wondering what services could be sort of in maybe back office services that would benefit from collaboration. What services would actually be really challenging to actually collaborate on for universities? And then what are the foundations for collaboration? So my background's actually in banking, and there was a lot of work done and outsourcing in the days of 20 years ago for BACS and financial transfers, and there was a lot of that going on that caused a lot of change in the industry and changed what banking and the services they did. So I was just interested in the panel's views on the foundations as well and what would need to change.
Thank you, Ben. The next question's from an anonymous person, so I'm going to read it out. Agency fees charged by overseas agents to recruit international students can be shared as a UK university sector. This creates a common bargaining power for the UK universities to set the common or flat agent fees payable. In this way, it avoids agents overcharging and collaboration between UK universities. How can this be achieved? So around collaboration to do with agent fees, which can be quite high, of course. Charles Knight, Advance HE. Let's go to Charles and then Andy, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Good afternoon, panelists. A very simple question. Two turkeys don't make an eagle is a quote about a very famous digital collaboration that went badly wrong. How does the sector pick winners in this space?
Golly, simple question, but difficult answer, I suspect. Andy Salmon. It's the last question we'll do in this round, and this may be the last round we have time for. Andy.
Also a simple question, and refers back to Sir Chris's point earlier. Thinking about the inclusive growth agenda particularly, and the gaps in terms of things that we as universities are not doing at the moment. So Chris, I wondered if you could say a little bit more about your point about gaps, because it seems to me that the scale of need is enormous, and that at a regional level, certainly, we could do much more together. There's a danger of underestimating the problem, is what I'm saying.
Thanks, Andy. Great. So we have 8 minutes left and 4 speakers. So you have 2 minutes each to deal with all those panoply of issues that were just raised. So you don't need to cover them all, but Chris, your name was mentioned in that last question. So over to you.
Well, you said I could get let rip on leadership. So
yeah, do that.
Hope everyone's sitting comfortably for the next few hours. Look, let me try and pull together a couple of issues. I think that the mode of leadership that you get in a sector is driven by the accountability indicators and the funding regime that you have in that sector. So the mode of leadership that we have now is the mode of leadership that has been driven by hyper competition over the last 15 years. It doesn't need to be like that. Now, that's not to say, and I think I said this in my opening comments, that competition hasn't delivered massive benefits. But I'm going to answer Mary's question, and I think Andy's question, through an analogy, and it goes a bit like this. The most successful school improvement initiative of the last quarter century was London Challenge. And the key shift in London Challenge was to shift the discourse for a head teacher, so that instead of saying that a head teacher should think about my school, the head teacher was asked to think about our children, and to think about the success of his or her school in relation to the success of children, in that case, across London. And that drove collaborative behaviours. It was a significant shift in language, a significant shift in thinking. And the space I think we have to get into is the space where part of the questions that leaders ask is about how they work effectively with others in terms of thinking about the institution in the context of its place, specific agenda, the system, HE system, and the nation. And I thought the question that we won't get to next, which is about how do you set VC performance indicators, starts to get you into that space. It's not about a revolution, but it's about a shift in emphasis that takes us from one sort of a system to another sort of a system.
Thank you, Chris. I think that also partly answers Carol Thomas from Buff Dog's question, which is in the Q&A, which is a very interesting and important question as well. Steph, UUK, what's your reflection on what you've heard?
Hugh and Paul's question together. To Hugh's point, so I mean, and I think you were making the second point here, Hugh, so don't get me wrong, but I think there is a real sense of urgency in the sector about understanding, people understand the scale of the challenge that's facing them and they're responding to it. I think your question was driving at how do you kind of get them to kind of recognise the scale of the issue, kind of move through their own individual solutions and then get to be having that kind of collaborative conversation whilst you've still got time to realise the benefits of that kind of collaborative conversation to kind of impact essentially before it's too late. And I do think that kind of links into Paul's question about kind of how do you de-risk this essentially for kind of executive and non-executive leadership teams within institution. And again, my sense is that that's probably about making it easier for people, making sure that you are kind of sharing what's already happening, making sure that they understand who they can go to for kind of advice and support. And one level, it's about incentivization, which slightly speaks to Chris's point as well, right? There are lots of kind of levels of incentives that you can bring into the system, but we do have a system in which you can introduce incentives or levers to kind of get people thinking about this. And clearly, when I'm talking about incentives, I'm thinking about kind of funding following some of these initiatives as well. And then I think there's a role for organisations like us and Jisc and other people to just make sure that it is on the kind of agenda, and to make sure that we're speaking about it. And events like today that kind of raise that the agenda, I guess, up the agenda and to get people talking about it.
Thank you, Steph. That's fantastic. I'm going to go to Sam next. Sam from KPMG.
Thank you. I might pick up, Nick, on the question around which services to focus on. And I think we've all got favourite quotes from the report. Mine, and apologies, I can't remember who it's from, was along the lines of, rather than trying to identify where we should collaborate, we should assume everything's in scope until we find a good reason for it not to be. And I think that really is sort of the key point for me. When you take a dispassionate view about who the end users and recipients of services are, what's required to deliver those services, what level of USP they actually deliver for universities, very quickly you establish a very, very long list of things you could look at, including things that have traditionally been completely out of scope, even into the registry space, which has always been sort of seen as being very much in the academic domain. If you really look at why students choose to go to an individual institution, what drives their experience of being in that institution, what drives academic experience. Many of the sort of services that are required to keep the lights on in a university really don't differentiate. They're essential. They're sort of like organs of the body, but they won't necessarily differentiate between those institutions. So from my perspective, there are huge swathes of the business that can be looked at right the way through, from sharing even sort of skills, technical support and things like that, through to the obvious candidates of back office. And I think sometimes we spend a bit too much time focusing on the back office. That too does link into a question that's raised about could you potentially share these services across multiple sectors? And the answer is yes, but the challenge has always been, and where we've engaged with sort of some of the larger third-party providers and outsourced service providers, the quantum of effort that will be required, the quantum of transactional effort required to make this worthwhile is enormous, and far greater than even a small number of institutions could bring to the table. When you consider within that anything that is slightly different about a sector makes it less attractive from a business case perspective, the fact that we have all sorts of strange peculiarities in the sector, like from a finance perspective, the treatment of the depreciation of research assets for HESA reporting, make that complicated. So it's back to the point I was making last time, which is where things can be simplified, there is a huge opportunity for collaboration across the sector, but also across multiple sectors. There will obviously be areas that won't work in as well.
Great. Sorry, I muted myself somehow. Last couple of minutes over to you, Liam. You're the co-host here. I'm also struck, we're a policy body, and I'm struck by how little we've spoken about policymakers. We seem to think this is an issue we own as a sector and the agencies we work with own as a sector. But is there a role for policymakers? The KPMG Jisc report talks about seed funding from government, for example. Not that the government has much spare cash at the moment. Final word, please.
So the idea around incentives definitely came through very strongly. As it's not just sticks that drive this, you need incentives as well. But we're under very few illusions about the availability of financial support from government. We have engaged with government bodies on this. I think there's a huge amount of interest in the report. I think that the objective for us is to demonstrate how any investment that might be made could be most effectively spent. I think there's something about the sector demonstrating that anything that was invested was not going to be wasted. So in terms of those changes, in terms of the operating model, how we deal with data management systems, implementations, etc. But I think there's also something, and I had a conversation this morning with one of the research councils, how policymakers can almost set the expectations about collaboration, in terms of what they're looking to see from the sector as a whole. And that was felt to be something very important. And in the report, we actually do talk as well about some of the ways in which the research councils, UKRI, etc., in terms of their policy objectives have tied funding in around some of those policy objectives as something worth considering.
Thank you. And of course, that takes us very neatly in our last 30 seconds to Bridget Phillipson's recent letter to the Vice Chancellors insisting in change in 5 areas, including efficiencies. So I think these are issues we're going to go on talking about. I suspect we could do a sequel to this event because we haven't got through all the questions, but we do have a hard cut-off for 3 o'clock. So I'm going to bring it to a halt there, other than to thank everyone for staying for the hour. Thank you for your questions. If we didn't get to your question, we will capture them and email them to our 4 speakers in case they want to correspond directly with you. Thank you to Sam, to Steph, to Chris. Particular thanks to Jisc, of course, for co-hosting this with us. And also massive thanks to my colleagues, particularly Emma, who's been doing the tech behind the scenes, and Carol, who helped with the organisation, and Lucy, our partnerships manager, partnerships director, rather, sorry, I should say, for all the huge amount of work that went on behind the scenes to put today together. Please do, if you're burning to say stuff you weren't able to say, think about writing for the HEPI blog, or indeed writing a full HEPI report on some of this stuff, because none of these issues are going to go away. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying for the full hour, and see you about. And look out for the next HEPI report, which is out on Thursday, on the rather controversial, should I say, issue of encampments and student protests on campus. That's coming out on Thursday. Many thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you.